For the communist forces in the rugged hills of Korea, the sound of battle had a familiar brutal rhythm, the crack of bolt-action rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the terrifying crump of mortar fire. But in 1950, a new sound began to cut through the chaos. It wasn't the slow, deliberate crack of a Mosin Nagant. It was a rapid, terrifying succession of 8 powerful shots followed by an unnerving metallic ping. This was the sound of the M1 Garand. And for those facing it, it was the sound of a new kind of horror. We're going to tell you the story of the rifle that changed the face of infantry combat and became a nightmare for the enemies of America. But how did one rifle give a single soldier the power to stop a human wave? The answer lies in a brilliant design tested in the most brutal conditions imaginable. On June 25, 1950, the world awoke to shocking news. The Cold War had turned hot. An army of over 90,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army, armed and trained by the Soviet Union, stormed across the 38th parallel. They shattered the peace and plunged the Korean peninsula into a brutal war. The United States, caught by surprise, had to scramble to respond. In the years following World War II, America's focus had shifted. The new titans of war were jet aircraft and atomic weapons, and the budget for conventional forces had been slashed. The first American troops rushed to the front lines were under-equipped and unprepared for the infantry struggle that awaited them. They faced a determined enemy, equipped with a hodgepodge of effective weaponry. The backbone of the North Korean and later Chinese armies was the bolt-action rifle, mostly the Soviet Mosin Nagant. It was a reliable, hard-hitting weapon, but it was slow to fire. To compensate, they used another Soviet tool with terrifying effectiveness, the PPSH-41 submachine gun. This burp gun with a drum magazine that held 71 rounds could spew a wall of lead at close range, creating shock and overwhelming defenders. The enemy's core tactic was built around these weapons. They maneuvered under the cover of darkness. They probed for the weakest point in the American lines. Then they would strike with what became known as the human wave attack. This wasn't a mindless suicidal charge. It was a calculated shock tactic designed to use masked infantry on a narrow front to break through and engage in brutal close-quarters combat. For the American G1 in a foxhole, armed with weapons from the last war, this was a uniquely terrifying prospect. What he needed was a weapon that could not only match the enemy's determination, but utterly dominate it. Fortunately, he had one. It was a 10-pounds gas-operated semi-automatic rifle that had already proven itself on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. It was the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1. In the frozen hills of Korea, it was about to earn a new fearsome reputation. The M1 Garand was no stranger to war. By the end of World War II, a staggering 5.44 million had been produced by Springfield Armory in Winchester, enough to arm the entire population of a small country. It had outfought the German Mauser and the Japanese Arisaka, earning General George S. Patton's famous praise as the greatest battle implement ever devised. After the war, hundreds of thousands of these rifles were meticulously refurbished and placed into storage, preserved in grease or new corrosion-inhibiting foil bags, waiting for the next call. That call came in the summer of 1950. Pulled from their crates, these World War II veterans were once again pressed into service. Production was even restarted to meet the new demand. New contracts were issued to companies like International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson, who along with Springfield Armory would produce over 660,000 new M1s during the Korean War era. What made the Garand the perfect solution to the problem in Korea? The answer lies in its brilliant design. While the average Chinese or North Korean soldier could fire his bolt-action rifle perhaps 15 times a minute, a trained American GI could send a storm of 40 to 50 aim shots downrange in that same minute. For every single shot an enemy soldier fired, the GI could answer with 3 of his own. This gave American infantry a staggering firepower advantage. The rifle was built around the powerful 30-06 Springfield cartridge, a round that left the barrel at nearly 2,800 foot-purse. This gave it a flat trajectory and devastating power, allowing a GI to reach out and hit a target from the length of 5 football fields away, far beyond the range of the enemy's submachine guns. The genius of John Garand's design was its gas-operated action, which used the expanding gases from a fired round to cycle the bolt and load the next cartridge automatically. All the soldier had to do was pull the trigger. 8 times he could do this as fast as he could reacquire his target. After the 8th shot, the empty clip was automatically ejected with that iconic ping. The rifle ready for a fresh one. This combination of rate of fire, power, and accuracy was exactly what was needed. But the M1's greatest test wouldn't be on a firing range. It would be in the crucible of a Korean winter. The winter of 1950 to 1951 in Korea was one of the coldest on record. As American and UN forces pushed north towards the Yalu River, they were met by the sudden massive intervention of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, and by an even more relentless enemy, the cold. Temperatures plunged to a soul-crushing 35 degrees below zero, freezing lubricants, disabling equipment, and sapping the will of even the hardiest soldiers. In this frozen hell, many weapons started to fail. Mortars became useless, their base plates shattering on the iron-hard ground. The M1 carbine developed a bad reputation as its bullets lost power in the extreme cold and its action froze shut. Even the venerable Browning automatic rifle could have its bolt freeze solid. But the M1 Garand endured. Marines and soldiers figured out a simple but effective trick. They stripped their M1s of all oil and grease. A lubricated rifle would freeze into a useless block of steel, but a dry M1, while it might cycle a bit rougher, would keep running. The weapon's robust design and loose tolerances proved to be a godsend. This reliability was the difference between life and death at the epic Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, where encircled elements of the 1st Marine Division fought a desperate breakout against 10 Chinese divisions. One Marine veteran of that fight called the M1 a masterpiece, recounting how as Chinese infantry swarmed his position, his Garand kept firing while other weapons froze. He stated bluntly, "It never failed you." When the bolt on his Garand did occasionally stick from the cold, a swift kick to the operating rod handle was all it took to get it back in the fight. For the men at Chosin, the M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was their lifeline. For the Chinese soldier, the first encounter with the M1 Garand was a moment of pure terror. He was trained for a war of deliberate shots, of cycling a bolt between each pull of the trigger. His officers had told him that American soldiers were soft, their weapons overly complicated. Then, out of the darkness came the attack. As his comrades charged forward, he expected to hear the familiar spaced-out cracks of enemy rifles. Instead, his ears were met with a terrifying semi-automatic roar. From a single American position, a torrent of fire erupted, 8 rounds impossibly fast, one after another. It was a volume of destruction he had never conceived of coming from one man. The sound was not just loud. It was continuous, overwhelming, a mechanical monster that never seemed to need to breathe. In that moment, all tactical training vanished, replaced by a primal fear of the storm of lead and the unnerving ping that signaled it was about to begin all over again. For Chinese commanders, the plan was simple. Use overwhelming numbers to close with and destroy the technologically superior UN forces. Their soldiers, disciplined and battle-hardened, would march for weeks to reach the battlefield. They would probe the lines, identify a weak point, and then, heralded by the eerie sound of bugles and whistles, they would attack. From the American foxhole, it looked like a literal human wave. A tide of quilted uniforms rising out of the darkness, seeming to shake the very earth as they charged. Against troops armed with bolt-action rifles, this tactic could be devastating. A defender might get off 1 or 2 shots before being overwhelmed. But the Chinese had never faced an entire army armed with the M1 Garand. This is where the battlefield calculus was completely transformed. That 3:1 firepower advantage wasn't a number on a page. It was a wall of lead and steel that rose to meet the charging enemy. Where one soldier with a Mosin Nagant fired 1 round, the American GY fired 8. A single squad of 12 GIS could unleash a storm of nearly 100 rounds of high-power 30-06 ammunition into an attack in mere seconds. This scenario was repeated across the peninsula from the desperate defense of the Busan perimeter to the bloody ridges of Heartbreak Ridge. The M1 Garand's sustained, accurate and powerful semi-automatic fire was the perfect antidote to the human wave, allowing small, outnumbered units to hold their ground against massive assaults. It was the hero of the foxhole. Beyond statistics and tactics, the story of the M1 Garand in Korea is a story of the bond between a soldier and his rifle. For the men who carried it through rugged mountains and muddy valleys, the Garand was a constant, reliable companion in a world of chaos. Beyond its function, the Garand became a source of profound psychological comfort. Famed military historian S.L.A. Marshall noted that soldiers developed a liking amounting to affection for it. In the isolating fear of a Korean night, the cold, heavy steel and smooth walnut stock were something real to cling to. It was more than a tool. It was the only predictable thing in a world of chaos. A 10-pound anchor of sanity when the bugles began to sound and the ground began to shake. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the M1 Garand had once again proven its worth. It had fought through the brutal summer heat, landed at Incheon, endured the frozen hell of Chosin, and held the line along the bloody 38th parallel. It had stood up ruggedly to terrain, weather, and rough handling, earning the unwavering respect of the men who carried it. For the communist forces who faced it, the M1 Garand was an instrument of terror. Its rapid, powerful fire shattered their tactics and broke their assaults, turning their greatest strength, manpower, into their greatest vulnerability. The rhythmic 8 shots and the final telling ping became the soundtrack to their defeat in countless engagements. For the soldier in the foxhole, survival wasn't a strategy, but a sound. 8 shots that held back the dark and the final metallic ping that promised another dawn.